Uh, as Dr. Barker said, I'm George Waldreich. I'm the president and CEO of the College of Physicians of Philadelphia, an organization which is just a few years younger than the American Philosophical Society. This is not the Academy Award, so we didn't want to have the chair of my board and me up here simultaneously doing an introduction, but I wanted to recognize Dr. Andrea Baldeck, who's here, who is a distinguished anesthesiologist and a highly published and exhibited photographer. Dr. Baldeck. As is my wont, I've probably been to too many grand rounds, and the introductions sometimes last longer than the speeches. Dr. Offit has known that I give very short introductions. I wanted to just point out the obvious, that he's head of the Vaccine Education Center at CHOP. He is an infectious disease doctor. And directly related to what he will be talking about, he's the Maurice R. Hilleman Professor of Vaccinology. As you all know, Maurice Hilleman was directly responsible for 9 of the 14 required vaccines for children. And Mrs. Lorraine Hilleman is here this evening, does not know that I was going to call and ask her to stand up and be recognized, but would like her to. The biographical information about Dr. Offit is in your pamphlets, and I know you can't get through the portals here unless you're fully literate, so you can all read that. But I want to add 2 personal notes. I've known Dr. Offit for several years. He's on my board of trustees right now. I really like him. And one of the reasons I like him is that he's a bright person who remembers what Edmund Burke may or may not have said about all that's necessary for the forces of evil to triumph is for enough good men to do nothing, or good people to do nothing. Dr. Offit cannot tolerate errant nonsense, and he can't tolerate cant from people who are immune to data. And if you look at his books and the books that he's written and that I've read and are really wonderfully written and a delight to read, listen to some of the titles. Bad Faith, When Religious Belief Undermines Modern Medicine. Deadly Choices, How the Anti-Vaccine Movement Threatens Us All. Autism's False Prophets, Bad Science, Risky Medicine, and the Search for a Cure. And my favorite, Do You Believe in Magic? The Sense and Nonsense of Alternative Medicine. I think the Brits' title is a little bit better. They call it Killing Us Softly, The Sense and Nonsense of Alternative Medicine. My second personal aspect about Dr. Offit, and it's particularly relevant here in the APS, where 2 local vaccinologists, virologists, Dr. Robert Austrian and Dr. Baruch Blumberg, were fellows of the APS. And how many have watched the World Series last night or any part of it? Okay, think of that field. Multiply the number of people there by 20. That's probably the minimum number of young children under the age of 5 whose lives are saved every year because of some of the work that Paul Offit has done. So, Dr. Offit, please.
The screen is lowering. I don't know if you see that. But. So what I want to talk about tonight is what is a cultural controversy, if not a scientific controversy, which is this fear of vaccines, which started, not surprisingly, with the first vaccine, the smallpox vaccine, which was developed by Edward Jenner in 1796. So what Jenner did was, and I think he's pictured there on the left, he realized that Jenner was a physician, a country doctor in southern England, who noted that every 2 to 3 years smallpox would sweep across the English countryside and leave a lot of death and devastation in its wake. But one thing it left was residual lesions. I mean, you could see these pock marks, which were forever with the exception of milkmaids. Milkmaids often didn't have those pockmarks, hence the expression, milkmaids have fair skin. So he made that association, actually, as others had actually about 20 years before him, that there was something connected by the fact that these milkmaids, when they would milk the udders of cows, would get these lesions, these blisters on their hands. And there was something in relationship between those blisters and then not getting smallpox. I mean, today what we know is that those blisters were caused by cowpox. We didn't know that then, but because the word virus really was just a non-specific term meaning poison, we didn't really know what viruses were. This was phenomenology at its best. So what he did ultimately was he then took those lesions and he would inoculate them into people, including his 15-month-old son, the kind of experiment you have a little trouble getting through institutional review boards today. But, and it worked, and he found that you were protected then against smallpox, and so the smallpox vaccine was cowpox, and that's where the word comes from. That's where vaccine comes. Vaca or waka in VACCA in Latin means cow. Wacanae is the genitive form meaning of the cow, and that's where the word vaccine comes from cowpox. Now, this was 1796. This was a cartoon done in 1804 by James Gilray, not too long after that, to show what was really people's fear of vaccines. So you see two things in this picture. One is that you see people are starting to develop cow-like characteristics. So you see they're developing horns, they're developing these sort of floppy ears, snouts. One person has a little cow coming out of his butt. I mean, this is, and we look at this today and we laugh reasonably but realize, I think, that frankly the biological basis of this concern is about the same strength as the biological basis that vaccines cause autism. But in any case, this is one part of this. But the other part, I think, that's striking and consistent and true up till today also is the look on Edward Jenner's face. Look at him. I mean, he's looking askance. He's inoculating this woman who clearly is fearful, and he doesn't care. And I think when you think about what this man has done, smallpox probably killed more people than any other infectious disease in history. It killed 500 million people. It changed the way it changed European history in many ways. And now we can say that with the vaccine, we eliminated this disease from the face of the earth. That's the power of vaccines. Yet still, he's portrayed here as disinterested and uncaring. So this is a placard from the Anti-Vaccination Society of America, an association, and it's in quotes to say that we're called this, but we're not really this, an association of half-mad, misguided people who write and toil and dream of a time to come when it shall be lawful to retain intact the pure body Mother Nature gave, sends greetings to a suspect of the vaccines. Liberty cannot be given, it must be taken. And this is a constant theme, and also a theme up to today. The word natural, Mother Nature, still has a lot of cachet, and I would argue I'd like to know who Mother Nature's public relations firm is, because Mother Nature can kill you. The reason that we live as long as we live is because we have been fighting back against Mother Nature ever since we crawled out of the ocean onto land. By having antibiotics or sanitation programs or vaccines, we fight back against Mother Nature so that we can live longer than we've ever lived before. This is sort of a cartoon that I think sort of summarizes this. Two cavemen sitting around, something's just not right. Our air is clean, our water is pure, we all get plenty of exercise, everything we eat is organic and free range, and yet nobody lives past 30. Okay, so the point being that the anti-vaccine movement was born, not surprisingly, of the first vaccine. The second, I think, round of the anti-vaccine movement came with the pertussis vaccine in 1982. This, I think, was the birth of the modern American anti-vaccine movement. It centered on a 1-hour documentary that was shown by NBC called DPT Vaccine Roulette, DPT standing for diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus, pertussis being the whooping cough vaccine. It was done by a veteran producer named Lee Thompson. It was a 1-hour show. It was ultimately segmented and shown on places like 2020. It was shown on a lot of morning shows. I remember when this came out. I was a fellow working under Stanley Plotkin at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and what it showed was a series of children with permanent brain damage following DPT vaccine. It was a dramatic movie. It showed children staring vacantly into the air with their bicycle helmets on because they were constantly seizing. They had withered arms and legs. They were drooling. And the parents all told the same story. My child was fine. Then they got this whooping cough vaccine, and this is what happened. And it was a dramatic, emotional, impactful film. And it gave birth to the modern American anti-vaccine movement. Barbara Loe Fisher, Kathy Williams, and Jeff Schwartz formed something called Dissatisfied Parents Together, DPT, which later changed its name to the National Vaccine Information Center. If you search the term vaccines, this often is one of the first sites that will come up. It's the cynically named National Vaccine Information Center, which I think would be more accurately named the National Vaccine Misinformation Center. Within 1 month of that program airing, Paula Hawkins, who was a Republican from Florida, held a congressional hearing to discuss vaccine safety, to look into this issue of whether this product that we thought was doing so much good, in fact, was doing far more harm than good. That's a picture of Paula Hawkins there at that committee meeting. The media coverage that claimed that the wholesale pertussis vaccine caused brain damage was enormous. I don't know if you remember, for those of you who are Philadelphians, the person who covered it here, who was a consumer reporter but no doubt took on this issue, was Herb Dennenberg. Remember Herb Dennenberg? This was his cause celeb. The result was a flood of lawsuits successfully claiming that the pertussis or whooping cough vaccine caused sudden infant death syndrome, it caused Reye's syndrome, it caused coma, it caused what was then called mental retardation, epilepsy, and transverse myelitis, which is a swelling of the spinal cord that can cause paralysis. And these lawsuits were enormously successful, and it brought pharmaceutical companies to their knees. Now, at the time, the epidemiological studies that were done during the next 10 years showed that there was no increased risk of epilepsy or developmental delays following the whooping cough vaccine. And genetic studies that were performed 25 years later showed that many of these children had something called Dravet syndrome, which is a problem sort of with sodium transport of the brain. It's a genetic abnormality. It has 100% penetrance, which is to say by the end of the first year of life, all of those children will have this essentially developmental delay or seizures independent of whether they've gotten the vaccine. But it took 25 years really to figure that out. So these studies really came far too late to stem the tide of fear of that whooping cough vaccine. And so the price of the whooping cough or DTP vaccine rose from 19 cents. I know, looking at some people from the pharmaceutical industry here, it's hard to believe that anything ever cost 19 cents, but it was 19 cents in 1980 to $12 in 1986. The number of oral polio vaccine makers, which was the Sabin vaccine, declined from 3 to 1, of measles vaccine makers from 6 to 1, and of pertussis vaccine makers from 8 to 1. And the last company actually that was left standing for the pertussis vaccine was Letterly Labs, and they were on the verge of stopping to make that product because, frankly, the litigation, the cost of the litigation was starting to exceed the revenue from that product. And so we were on the verge of losing vaccines for America's children. And so it was the Reagan administration that stepped in, oddly, not an administration necessarily known for its social programs, but that they stepped in and created something called the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, which included the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. So the way that worked, and still works, is that for every dose of vaccine, there's roughly 75 cents per dose that goes into a federally funded program to compensate children who may or may not have been harmed by vaccines. So if it's three components like, say, measles, mumps, rubella, then that's $2.25. There's more than $3 billion currently sitting in that program. And what that did was it stopped the bleeding. It meant that now you had to go through this federally funded program if you wanted to sue about vaccines before you could go to pharmaceutical companies. And frankly, because the bar is so low for proof in this federal program, if you can't win in vaccine court, you're never going to win in civil court. So for the most part, it really has protected vaccine makers and thus the vaccine infrastructure in this country from what was a time when, frankly, it was on the verge of elimination. Now, the National Vaccine Information Center, which was born of this particular moment, continues to weigh in on vaccine safety. Their basic construct is that vaccines have merely replaced infectious diseases with chronic diseases, and take your pick: autism, asthma, allergies, developmental delays, multiple sclerosis, diabetes. They're very good at what they do in a sort of evil way. They're media savvy, they're politically connected, they're lawyer-backed, and they're very passionate. And so, if you look historically at when any new vaccine was introduced following this event in 1982, the National Vaccine Information Center, with people like Barbara Loe Fisher, were always there to weigh in on vaccine safety. So when the Hib vaccine was first introduced in the late 80s, there Barbara Loe Fisher was on national television saying that this vaccine caused diabetes. When the pneumococcal vaccine was introduced in 2000, there was Barbara Loe Fisher claiming that the vaccine caused seizures. When the hepatitis B vaccine was introduced, actually for newborns in the early 1990s, there was a show on 2020 with Sylvia Chase as the correspondent, stating that the hepatitis B vaccine caused multiple sclerosis in adolescents, that it caused sudden infant death syndrome in newborns, and these were very dramatic shows. I remember the one on 2020. You had a mother saying her child was fine. They got the hepatitis B vaccine. In this case, it was the second dose of the hepatitis B vaccine, and within days of that, the child had died. And then you focus in on that grave site, which was Lila Rose, our little angel, and it was very dramatic. I mean, I remember a nurse in our hospital who came in the day after that this program aired and said, "That's it. I'm not participating in this tragedy anymore. I'm not giving the hepatitis B vaccine." So, emotion often trumps reason, and I think that's really where the National Vaccine Information Center was coming from. And most recently, the notion that the human papillomavirus or HPV vaccine caused blood clots or strokes or chronic fatigue syndrome. Katie Couric had a show specifically talking about this, all of which has clearly been shown in studies not to be true. I mean, frankly, of all the vaccines, there's probably been no vaccine that has had more post-licensure testing, formally tested in about 1 million people to show that the vaccines the only thing that the human papillomavirus vaccine causes is fainting. That's it. And frankly, you don't even have to give the vaccine. Just unsheathing the needle seems to work. Being second in line seems to work. So the vaccine does cause fainting. That's true. But it doesn't cause these chronic pain or chronic fatigue syndromes that are claimed. Okay, so now we go to the anti-vaccine movement round 3. This is the one that you're probably most familiar with, which was the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine in 1998. So this was born of a paper that was published in The Lancet by the senior author of whom was Andrew Wakefield. Just out of curiosity, how many of you have heard the name Andrew Wakefield? Okay, good. So not all of you. This makes me feel better. So this was a case series. It included 12 children, 8 of whom had autism, within a month of receiving MMR vaccine. Now Wakefield's hypothesis was this, that because you were giving the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine all together in one shot, because it was 3 in 1, that caused your immune system to be overwhelmed, that you were now immune compromised. Now, it would not have been hard for him to do studies, because certainly standard tests existed at the time, to see whether, in fact, there was evidence of an inability to respond to standard stimuli at the time, antigenic stimuli. That was never done. So he never really did, even though he proposed it, he never really tested to see whether really these kids did have a blunted immune response. He then claimed that because the immune response was blunted, the measles component of the vaccine traveled to the intestine, reproduced itself in the intestinal epithelial cells, the lining of the intestine, and damaged the intestinal surface. This also wouldn't have been hard to prove. He'd done intestinal biopsies. All he had to do was look in the cells to see whether there was measles virus proteins there or measles virus genome there. He didn't do that either. Then he claimed that because the intestine was damaged, it allowed for the ingress or the entrance of encephalopathic or brain-damaging proteins into the bloodstream that then traveled to the brain, crossed an intact blood-brain barrier, and caused autism, for which he also had no evidence. He made this sort of vague, hand-waving notion that maybe it was gluten in breads, maybe it was casein in milk and cheeses, but he had no evidence for any of this. I mean, frankly, the most amazing part of this paper was not the claim that the MMR vaccine caused autism, which is fantastic enough, but that it was ever published. He had a series of hypotheses for which he offered not one shred of evidence. And if you believe Carl Sagan's statement that extraordinary claims should be backed by extraordinary evidence. This was an extraordinary claim that was backed by no evidence. Also, just as a tip, there were essentially 8 study subjects in this paper, and there are 13 authors. You should always have more study subjects than authors, just if you're going to be an epidemiologist. Okay, so that's Andrew Wakefield, who made that claim. And to many children, to many parents of children with autism, he was a hero. I mean, he was the first doctor who cared. He was the first one who said, look, this is a devastating disorder, and I have the reason. I have the cause for this, and it's the MMR vaccine. And he was, to underline his sort of the degree to which he was treated as a hero, there was within a few years of this publication a made-for-TV movie called Hear the Silence. It was not big in the United States, but it was very big in Europe, especially in the United Kingdom. And it starred 2 very popular television stars. One is the woman on the left here. Her name was Juliet Stevenson. She played the role of a mother who was trying to search for a reason that her child had autism existed. She went back through a series of photographs and saw that he was smiling and smiling and smiling until he received the MMR vaccine. Then he wasn't smiling anymore. Therefore, the MMR vaccine must have caused it. And the role of Andrew Wakefield was played by Hugh Bonneville, who was also a very popular actor. He was the doctor who listened. He was the doctor who cared. Finally, these doctors weren't just putting us off and telling us that the vaccines weren't causing autism. He was the one who believed us. And this, I think, frankly, even more than the paper and more the publication of the paper and more than the media coverage that followed that paper, this movie had an enormous impact in the United Kingdom. Now, since the publication of since that publication, there have been 17 studies that have been performed looking at the question, does MMR cause autism? This is an answerable question. This is shown on this slide. It's shown on the next slide. This shows, I think, 10 of the 17. It's not a hard question to answer. All you have to do is retrospectively look at children who did or didn't get the vaccine and see whether or not the incidence of autism is greater in a vaccinated group. This has been done 17 times. I mean, you're not trying to answer how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. This is a scientific question that can be answered in a scientific venue and has been answered in a scientific venue. 17 studies have been done. And the difference between this story and the pertussis story or whooping cough story that I just told you, it took a fairly long time for the academic and public health community to respond to the pertussis fear. I think no one could believe it because it was such an outrageous claim. And because, I think physicians and scientists thought there's just no basis on this, that we really have to study this, that it took a while to do that. But after watching what happened with the pertussis vaccine in the 1980s, when Andrew Wakefield stood up and claimed MMR vaccine causes autism, the academic and public health community was ready. And within months, actually, Brent Taylor, who interestingly worked at the same hospital as Andrew Wakefield in England, the so-called Royal Free Hospital, had a paper out there looking at this, and many studies followed. So I think we were ready. We were primed by what had happened with the pertussis vaccine. Now, the key person in this whole story to me is this guy, whose name is Brian Deer. He was an investigative journalist who worked for The Guardian as well as the Sunday Times of London. He was an independent journalist, but he worked with both of those papers. And what he did was he found that Wakefield had actually misrepresented clinical and biological data in his study. So not only was it just a case series of 8 children who had autism following vaccine, but he actually had inverted, in a couple cases, the child's receiving the vaccine and developing signs and symptoms of autism. In a couple of those cases, the signs and symptoms of autism had preceded the vaccine. He also misrepresented biological data, meaning his spinal fluid findings. So even though the paper was thin to begin with, he still misrepresented that. Frankly, this paper was no different than making the claim. I remember when I was a resident at Children's Hospital in Pittsburgh, there was a woman who brought her son in with basically new onset leukemia. And like all of us, she was trying to figure out what was it that could cause this boy's leukemia. And she believed that it was caused by peanut butter sandwiches, that this is something he had just recently eaten, it had only been within the previous month, and that it was peanut butter sandwiches that were doing it. That's a studyable question. It's never been studied, but I suspect we would find that peanut butter sandwiches don't cause leukemia. But this is really no different than that. I mean, it was got an MMR vaccine and developed autism. Remember, at this time in 1998, the incidence of MMR vaccination in England was 90%. The incidence of autism then was 1 in 2,000. This would mean that every year about 300 children in England should have developed autism within a month of receiving that vaccine. That had to happen unless the vaccine prevented autism, which it doesn't. It only prevents measles, mumps, and rubella infection, which is really the problem with vaccines. They don't prevent everything else that occurs in the first few years of life, so there are always going to be those temporal associations. The other thing that Deere found was that Wakefield had apparently, without mentioning this to his co-authors, received about $800,000 through her personal injury lawyers to essentially launder legal claims through a medical journal. 5 of the 8 children in that study who had developed autism, the parents were in the midst of suing pharmaceutical companies, neglected to mention that to his co-authors. Probably nothing upsets people more than this sort of notion that you've been receiving money and have neglected to tell anybody about it. For that reason, this paper was retracted. Now, every year in this world, there are about 4,000 medical and scientific papers that are published in the world's literature a day, about 4,000 papers a day. Some of those papers are excellent, some of those papers are awful, most are more or less mediocre, but there's a lot of bad science that gets published. You really have to go do something to get your paper retracted, and that's what he did. I mean, I think the financial connection, probably more than anything else, really upset people. The other thing was that he had, as controls, he had collected blood from children who had attended his son's birthday party, without getting any sort of, permission to do that. So that also upset people. Not a fun party. After this was revealed and his paper was retracted, he then lost his medical license to practice in England, and so he came initially to Melbourne, Florida, where he worked with a couple of doctors named Jerry Cartsinell and Jeff Bradstreet. They called themselves the Good News Doctors because they, too, like him, had treatments for autism. Like avoiding gluten and casein. He eventually left them and worked for a group called Thoughtful House in Austin, Texas. He actually left there, and now I'll get to what he's doing in a second, but he still lives in Austin, thus keeping Austin weird. I don't know if you've ever seen that T-shirt, Keep Austin Weird. But that paper had an impact. Because of that paper, and because I think of the media coverage and also the movie, there were thousands of people in England and in the United Kingdom who chose not to give their children MMR vaccine. There were 4 children who died in the United Kingdom and Ireland of measles because the parents made that choice. I think you could argue reasonably that paper killed 4 children. And although one could reasonably put that at the feet of Andrew Wakefield, I think a lot of people had dirty hands in this. I think the editor-in-chief of the journal, who was Richard Horton, still chose to publish that paper, even though 4 of the 6 people who reviewed it said that it should have been rejected. He had been a friend of Andrew Wakefield. He had been a classmate with Andrew Wakefield, and so he was a friend of him. And he thought, well, let's just put that hypothesis out there and see whether, it actually flies. Well, it didn't fly, but it certainly did a lot of harm. I think the old Jonathan Swift line is, falsehood flies and the truth comes limping after, and that was true here. I think in the United States also there was an impact of that paper, because I think still, if you ask 1,000 people, parents, whether or not vaccines might cause autism, I still think a significant percentage would say yes. In this country, parents of more than 125,000 children chose not to vaccinate, and so we had outbreaks. In 2014, there was an outbreak involving about 680 people, mostly children with measles. This is a disease that we had eliminated from the United States by the year 2000, but it had come back because parents were scared of measles-containing vaccines for fear that it might cause autism. And then in 2015, we had the outbreak in Disneyland that started in Disneyland and then spread outward. Interestingly, most people don't know this, but this outbreak was predicted. It was predicted by a guy named Gary Baum. What he did, he was a journalist, and he went around to elementary schools in Southern California, in suburban Los Angeles, like upscale areas like Marina del Rey and and found that in many of these elementary schools, immunization rates were less than 50%. And he published that. He said that here we have in Southern California immunization rates that are less than South Sudan, and he published it in my favorite medical journal, The Hollywood Reporter. It's true. And so, and he was right, and then came those outbreaks that started in Disneyland. And so, see this, Doc says, don't be dopey, vaccinate your kids. Even Mickey, you know, measles. And the outbreak started in Southern California and then spread ultimately to about 25 states. It involved roughly 189 people, mostly children who were unvaccinated. Fortunately, no one died. You really have to get to at least 1,000 to 2,000 children infected before you start to see measles deaths, but I don't think we should really find that out. Okay, so now we go to the last round of the anti-vaccine movement, because I think the question that I posed at the beginning, the vaccine wars, who's winning, is I think children are winning, and I'll tell you why, because I think things have dramatically turned for the better. There was a movie that was made by Andrew Wakefield. He's now reinvented himself as a documentary filmmaker, called Vaxxed. See the XX there, just in case you're unclear whether or not vaccines are bad, from cover-up to catastrophe. I was actually, well, I'll get to that. So there's Andrew Wakefield looking critically at data, and the guy actually on your right is Del Bigtree, who's the producer of this movie. And so it's basically your basic conspiracy theory movie, which is that there's a CDC whistleblower who was associated with one of those studies that was done by the CDC, and the thinking is that data were misrepresented in a paper, and he's now stepping forward to tear the whole thing down, basically. It was just sort of a disagreement, and a mild one, about how data should be presented. But in any case, the CDC whistleblower, a man named William Thompson, had called one of the anti-vaccine people, because he's at least naive, to say that there was this discrepancy, a guy named Brian Hooker. That was recorded without his knowledge. And when he realized that he'd been recorded, he then sought whistleblower status because he was scared that he was going to get fired. And so that's really the basis of this whole movie, which would have gone away completely, except that Robert De Niro decided initially that he was going to allow this movie to be shown in his film festival, the Tribeca Film Festival, a festival that he had started around 2002. Then, under pressure, he changed his mind. Now, the anti-vaccine people, not shockingly, thought that all of this pressure came from the pharmaceutical industry. I only wish they had that kind of power. They actually don't. Or that it came from the medical establishment. Also not true. I only wish we had the power to decide which movies got shown at Tribeca or not. We don't either. It came from other filmmakers. Primarily, actually, a filmmaker named Penny Lane, who had done a number of films on Brinkley, the guy who showed that you could increase male potency by giving goat testicles, injecting that. I don't know if you remember that story. Or she had another story about showing Richard Nixon's home movie. She was a very influential filmmaker, and she said, you've really cheapened this festival by showing this kind of movie here, and so the movie was withdrawn. But that was great as far as Andrew Wakefield and the producers were concerned, because now they could claim, see, this is the movie they don't want you to see. They, of course, being the pharmaceutical industry and the medical establishment. Now, let me go back a step. I was actually asked, see, there's a lesson here. When Gary Baum wrote that article, I actually had seen that article, not because I was subscribed to the Hollywood Reporter, but because people had sent me that article actually around the time that it came out. So I had read that article. And when the outbreak occurred, I actually called Gary Baum and said, just congratulated him on his careful reporting and his ability to predict the future. And so when this movie came out, I was actually asked to review the movie for the Hollywood Reporter, which was fun. Right? Because previously I would be publishing in places like the Journal of Virology, but now I got to publish the Journal of Virology and the Hollywood Reporter. So that was cool. So here's how I ended this review. For people who believe that President Barack Obama is not a U.S. citizen, that the moon landing was filmed on a Hollywood soundstage, and that an intergalactic board of elves and fairies are trying to get the IRS out of Puerto Rico, this movie is for you. For the rest, I would recommend waiting for a film that explains what internal demons drive a man from a field that demands logic and reason into a world where logic and reason are the enemy. Andrew Wakefield didn't like this review for whatever reason. I don't know why, but it's just not open-minded, I guess. So in any case, I'm almost to the end here, but I think if you look at the way Vax was covered, just out of curiosity, how many of you have heard of the movie Vaxxed? Okay, thank you. How many of you have seen the movie Vaxxed? Right, so it's like one. That's the usual story. I mean, it's just like people have heard of it. People especially who are in the vaccine world have heard of it. Very few have seen it. It was here in Philadelphia. I mean, it was at the Ritz, which is just a few blocks from where I live. And Andrew Wakefield was here, actually. He was here. I think Del Bigtree was here. The producer was here to discuss the movie. I don't think many people saw it. I live at 4th and Spruce, so not that far from the Ritz. He never stopped by to say hi. I don't get it. But this movie was routinely vilified by the media, which talked almost solely about a discredited doctor promoting a debunked hypothesis. And so if you look at the arc, at the narrative arc of this story, I think if you look at the degree to which DPT vaccine roulette was not only taken up by the press and the public, but by Congress, or here the silence, which also was taken up by the press and by the public. And now look at this movie, which has basically just been shoved to the side. I think it tells you that we're winning. And so this is my last slide. I think the difference, the reason that things have gotten better is that the studies done in response to Wakefield's claim were done quickly and universally because we learned from the pertussis story. I think the other thing that you see now that you didn't see then is scientists and science bloggers have really taken to the internet and airwaves to counter bad information. There are a lot of doctors out there, I think, that are finally willing to step forward in this, and the science bloggers, I don't know if you follow the science bloggers, but people like Orak at Respectful Insolence and the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, which is Steve Novella, Harpocrates, they're present. And whenever the anti-vaccine people puts whatever their most recent fear is out there, these people are all over it and providing information and data for anybody who is trying to counter that. So this is also good. I think the other thing is that the anti-vaccine movement attached its star to Wakefield. And as he fell, they fell. The last time Wakefield, who was a media darling, I mean, I had to appear in front of Dan Burton's Office of Government Reform, the Committee of Government Reform. And Wakefield was one of the panelists, and I was a panelist. I mean, he was feted. He's good looking, he's square jawed, he has that British accent, which we all adore. I think we're perfectly willing to give ourselves back to the Queen at this point. And so, and he was everywhere. And the last time he was covered by anybody in the mainstream was Anderson Cooper had him on in 2011 and just let him have it. It was great. And so I think in a better world, the fact that his paper was wrong should have been enough to dismiss it because it was wrong and it was shown to be wrong. But I think that he was wrong and fraudulent also really helped us. And the anti-vaccine movement, I think, made a mistake attaching itself to him because it went, as he went down, they went down. The other thing, and this is the sad truth, and sort of in dealing with Dr. Hilleman in the last 6 months of his life, I remember asking him the question, isn't there some way we can educate people about the importance of vaccines and the tragedies of these diseases without having to watch children suffer again? And his feeling at the time was that no, that in order for people really to understand the importance of these diseases, they had to see them. And I think sadly, nothing educates like the virus. I mean, when that measles outbreak occurred in Southern California and then spread across many states in this country, that's when people got scared. That's when people in Southern California went running to their doctors to get a measles vaccine because now they saw it knocking next door. But it wasn't before that, and it's sad because I think children are probably always the first to suffer our ignorance. So I'll stop there, and thanks for your attention.